Our new chapter is going to take a look at how the ideas of the Enlightenment began to change and influence government systems. We talked about the concept of the Enlightenment, but we're going to actually look at its effects. Last Friday during the test, I had a student say, Mr. Simpson, could someone really begin to overthrow the government, like Locke had said, if government stops doing its job, and that's what you need to do? Today we're going to take a look at that. We're going to begin discussing the next few days England's Revolution, England's first civil war. During this time period, there were basically two parts to English government. Yes, they had judges, but judges weren't a major impact on this era in English history. There was the monarchy, the king, and there was Parliament, their legislative body, their group of people that was helping make the laws. Their main job at this time was to advise the king, to give the king some advice on what he should do. During this time period, though, the English monarch was an absolute monarch. The king didn't necessarily want to listen to Parliament, like he probably should have. Also during this time period, because of this, the king could get rid of Parliament whenever he wanted to. Just tell them, guys, I don't even want to listen to y'all anymore. I'll just do my own thing. In 6th grade social studies, you talk about a family of rulers that I really like called the Tudors, and you get to talk about Henry VIII and his kids and his many wives. But when his last child that was a ruler, Queen Elizabeth, died, she didn't have any family to step up and take over, no children. And so a distant relative, King James VI of Scotland, was brought in to be the king. In England, he's going to become known as King James I. Well, Parliament and the monarchs tended to get along kind of like oil and water. For those of you not familiar with that cliche, oil and water don't really mix so well. Those of you who like to cook probably know this. When you pour oil in a thing of water, you'll kind of see them stay separate. Well, ever since the Lords had made the King of England, King John, sign the Magna Carta, Parliament and the English monarch, they just didn't get along. From that time on, the monarchs kept trying to take back the power that King John had willingly handed over, and Parliament was obviously trying to make sure that the monarchs didn't get the power back. Because of the Magna Carta, England became the first limited government, but by the time period of James and his family, we'll see that England had become more and more of an absolute monarch system of government, which meant suddenly there were basically no limits to the power of the king. Although at the beginning of this video I kind of mentioned the family that's taking over, really quickly look back at last year. Henry VIII, in addition to his many wives, is really famous for the fact that he's the first king of England to separate England from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had been the sole source of answers during the Middle Ages. One day, the King of England, Henry VIII, wakes up and realizes he doesn't like the Catholic Church's answer to everything, and so he decides to start his own church in England, today called the Church of England. When he died, his daughter Mary, Bloody Mary, decided to restore the Catholic Church. And then when she died, her sister Elizabeth took over, and she kicked the Catholics kind of back out, and restored England to being its own kind of thing, having its own church called the Church of England. But when she died, they had to bring in her cousin, King James of Scotland, to be the King of England. King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England because England hadn't had a King James up until that point. And I gotta be honest, I just love his name. I think he's got a great name. And, here is, me and my wife. But this is why King James has a great name. Well, Elizabeth had kind of helped restore some of this absolute power to the English monarchy because she came along at just the perfect moment. There was the church issue going on. There was a war with Spain going on. The people wanted Elizabeth in charge. She just had that kind of concept around her that everybody loved her. Well, King James, who wasn't English, he was Scottish, comes in, and during this time period, Scotland and England were separate countries. The English weren't necessarily as thrilled with James. He's king for a while, but he really buys into this absolute monarch thing, and the English aren't thrilled to have this Scottish guy trying to be an English monarch. He does have two big things he's famous for doing, though. He publishes the King James Version of the Bible. He has some guys translate the Bible into English and his translation is still today considered one of the greatest literary works of all time. Even though he didn't write it, he gets credit for translating it. His other big deal is he's one of the first people to warn people of the dangers of tobacco. We talked about a few weeks ago that the English go to America, they discover tobacco, they decide it's great, and they are smoking it a lot. King James comes along and says, hey, people, this is going to kill you. Everybody else in the world at this time said, the king's crazy, smoking's great for you. Now, please, before you go home and say, Mr. Simpson said smoking is great for you, realize James was right. And the rest of the world at the time was wrong. Today we know that he was right and everybody else was crazy. Well, eventually King James dies, like we all do sooner or later. And at that point his son takes over. His son was named Charles. And so we get a dynasty of this family called the Stuarts. Charles I wanted to be an absolute monarch, much like his father had wanted to be an absolute monarch. But by this point, Parliament was getting tired of this. And they started wanting a definite say in making laws. No questions about it, no comments about it. They wanted to have power. One of my favorite shows growing up when I was little was this show called Charles in Charge. And it was all about this family who moves into this house. They're kind of wealthy. They've got a couple of kids. And they need a nanny, and so they get this guy who's down and out on his money and all that, and his name is Charles. And Charles takes over, hence the name of the show, Charles in Charge. And he watches the kids, and it was a funny show, cheesy show, but it was a good point. Well, Charles I of England wanted to be in charge. He wanted to have his own TV show, his own theme song about Charles in Charge. Well, Parliament wants to have a say. Charles wants to say no. Absolute monarchs, we talked about a few weeks ago, had the power to get rid of the legislative body, to get rid of the lawmaking groups. And so Charles does it. Charles decides that he's just going to flat out ban Parliament, kick them out, and fire them. And he's going to be the only guy with any power in England at that point. He locks them out of their building for 11 years. 11 years, he's the only guy in England with power. Still today, the English do not appreciate Charles doing this, and they call this the 11 years tyranny. I have a picture here of some aliens blowing up the White House. It's kind of similar, in theory, I guess. Charles gets rid of part of government, the aliens got rid of the White House. Scary side note, I'll never forget when this movie was first coming out, everybody would cheer when you were in the theaters when the White House got blown up. Americans tend to like a limited government, just like the English of this time period. You know, it just kept getting worse. If you watch the movies, Medea just does so many things. And anybody with common sense will tell you, sooner or later, you're going to get caught. And Medea went to jail. But in reality, we're not here to talk about Medea and her legal problems. But it's very similar to the story of Charles. Charles began taking more and more powers. And one power he decided to take was the power to tax people, without giving Parliament a right to say anything about it. He would just decide what taxes were. One member of Parliament decided to put his foot down and said, you know what, I'm not going to pay this tax. King Charles is a tyrant, and I don't like it. And so King Charles did what government does if you don't do what you're told. He locked the guy up. Now, I want you to know, this would be like if our president started locking our senators and congressmen up today. Now, I'll be honest, there are probably a lot of people that would like that. There are probably a lot of people that would dislike this. The English people were not impressed. In one of my all-time favorite movies, this guy is going to discuss how he deals with situations. He likes to take a situation right up to the point where he knows if he goes any further, he's going to get in trouble, and then he takes that next step anyway. A lot of students do the same thing. They know where the point is when they push it any further, and they're going to get in trouble, and then they just decide to see if they can take it that step extra, and they wind up in trouble. King Charles had this same kind of mindset. He's just locked up a member of Parliament for failing to pay taxes. The people aren't happy. For one thing, they don't necessarily want to pay the extra taxes either. But Parliament's supposed to stand up for the people. And he's arrested one member, and suddenly he decides that one's just not enough, and he arrests 5 more members of Parliament that were getting on his nerves. The problem with this is Parliament represented the regular people. And so the regular people got very angry at King Charles for doing this. And we're going to talk tomorrow about what the people's response is. Let me tell you, it's not going to go good for Charles.